Welcome to the Million Vegan Grandmothers podcast. And today I have Janet O'Shea. She is in the Department of World Culture and Art and Dance at UCLA. She's an author and an activist, a musician, a martial artist, and so much more. And right now, Janet is working, her focus is on physicality, emotion in social justice efforts, along with many other things. So thank you, Janet, for being here.
Thank you, Tami. It's an honor to have this conversation with you.
Great. Jenna's going to be at our next convergence, our VCOP Convergence of the People. She's going to be speaking out. Can you share a little bit about what you are going to be sharing during the 9th? I think you're on the 9th and 10th of November.
Absolutely. So my paper addresses, or my talk, I should say, addresses a central problem as I see it within the mainstream environmental movement, which is that the mainstream environmental movement accepts that animal agriculture is a key contributor to the climate crisis and to other forms of environmental degradation. And yet, whenever this comes up, particularly in journalistic outlets, the common rejoinder is, well, but we can't really focus on individual efforts. That's a distraction, or it's virtue signaling. We need to focus on systemic change, as if veganism and the movement for earth and animal liberation could only ever be a lifestyle choice, and as if it couldn't be a form of social justice mobilization. Now, fortunately, the Climate Healers has a rejoinder to this already. As you know, Dr. Sailesh Rao has pointed out that anyone who says that you can't mobilize people to take voluntary action at once is not paying attention to history, is not looking at Indian nationalism and Mohandas Gandhi's ability to mobilize people around the Khadi movement. That is the wearing of homespun cloth as a rejection of British imperial products. So what I'm doing in this talk is I actually take up that idea and then delve into it in detail to think about, how did the Khadi movement do this? How did Gandhi actually do this, like structurally? How did it work? What were the tactics? And so just to be absolutely clear, I'm not comparing forms of harm. I'm not saying British imperialism and animal exploitation or ecocide are the same thing. I'm not saying the victims are the same. I'm looking at the structure of the social movement to see what, as environmental and animal advocates, what we can learn from how to successfully mobilize people towards voluntary action that then can become systemic change.
That's so important. What do you think interferes with that? One of my assessments is accumulated grief. People have so much going on and they have so much trauma and grief they haven't dealt with, that they're just like, not another thing, especially another thing that looks so hard to look at.
I think that's part of it. Absolutely. I think both animal exploitation and the extreme damage that we're inflicting on our natural environment, both of those are so big and they're so overwhelming. I think the other thing is that with a lot of social justice movements, we can very clearly identify victims and perpetrators, even if that perpetrator is systemic. Whereas in this situation, we are the victims and we are the perpetrators at the same time. And I think that's a really hard thing to face. And it's a really hard thing to then mobilize around undoing, because in some ways, when we look at the environmental crisis, we're on the surface, it looks like we're asking people to give something up. And we're asking people to do the hard work of being the person who stands out, to be the difficult person. And of course, as animal advocates and as environmental activists, we know that if we build a world that is more just for animals and more gentle to our environment, that world can also be better for humans. We can actually have a better way of life for all of us. But to get to that does require being willing to step out, stand out, and be marked as different. And I think that's really hard for people to embrace that. And I think that's another reason why looking at the Khadi movement is so interesting, that it's easy to sit here now and say, well, giving up or changing your food choices is really hard. Oh, changing your clothing, that can't be that difficult. But when you look at like how important clothing is to people and how tied it is to personal identity, and then you look at those images from the early 20th century of what khadi looked like, it was so simple, it was so plain. And to just ask people to do that, they did have to stand out. And then eventually there was a critical mass and it became something that people wanted to join in on. There was a positive peer pressure.
You've just said so many things here and really powerful things. So, the first thing that really struck me was that we have to identify that we're both victim and perpetrator at the same time. That's huge. And then we have to leave cultural norms. And that, I've been the only vegan in my family for a very long time, my biological family, not my spiritual family, which ends up taking a huge piece of our life and into the soothing realm. But it's a lot for people that already have a lot going on. I just feel right now, with the state of the world, the information that we're given, and both false and true, have created a society of survival, not thrive, survival instead of thriving. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where thinking systemically is so important. I think maybe one of the problems with the vegan movement specifically is that it's been so focused on individual change and on person-to-person influence, that there has been a neglect of the focus on institutional endeavors and on systemic change and on frontline communities, considerations like environmental justice, considerations like workers' rights. And I think focusing too much on individual action, it can look like a luxury, right? For those reasons that you're talking about of, hey, I'm just trying to get by. And I think if we shift the focus to talk about individual action is part of this picture of moving towards a more just food system, what it enables us to do is it enables us to point out that all of these harms are interconnected, that we have a system that's built on normalized violence. And the exploitation of animals and ecocide is part of that. And it's not a separate issue. We don't have to only focus on animals or the environment and neglect all these horrible things that are happening to humans, through the exploitation of workers and sort of neo-imperial extractive systems. All of those things are part of a system of normalized violence.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And when, the acronym HEAL that we use at Climate Healers and the Million Vegan Grandmothers is human, earth, and animal liberation.
Yeah.
So it's for all those reasons. And that is why community, as we move into becoming vegans, healthy communities are so important. I mean, I'm part of the World Peace Diet community with Dr. Will Tuttle. I'm part of Climate Healers. I'm part of the Million Vegan Grandmothers Interfaith Vegan Coalition. So I think that when we become part of communities, vegan communities, and continue branching out from there, there's a certain strength that happens in that. And when we realize, and right now, the grandmothers are developing a mentorship with the youth, because we're finding a lot of youth are feeling kind of hopeless. And, we say hopeless is kind of fear-based, and faith is understanding that there's a way through. We already have the answers. So it's providing, hey, we already have the answers, and mentoring the youth and coming forth, because it's our responsibility now as people that are maturing and understand certain things on a very clear level to be there for the young people. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the point you raised about community is so important. There's a sociologist named Damon Centola he wrote a book called Change, and not surprisingly, it's a theory of how change happens. And he takes up this idea of like change happens through viral networking, right? And that's like this idea that we have that we can bring about change by getting a message out through like these pinpoint networks that reach long distances and connect people who are not connected. And his argument, I think is so interesting, is like, that's true for simple messages. For complex messages, you don't need long networks, you need wide bridges. And so wide bridges are about community, about reinforcing messages and making sure people feel comfortable with change, that they feel supported in change. And that's how you bring about, how you convey complex messaging, and then that's also how you bring about change. And I think it's such a crucial part of that to have intergenerational involvement, because it's too easy for a justice movement to be dismissed if it's only a movement of the young or only a movement of middle-aged people or older people. Because if you're at a certain point in the lifespan or on life stage, it's easy to say, oh, well, that's a preoccupation that, you have, because if you're like a middle-aged person with a regular job, like you're secure in your life, so you can think about these things. Or if you're a retired person, it's like, oh, you have this luxury. Or if you're a young person, it's like, oh, well, you're all fired up. But when you settle into the demands of home and family and work, you won't be thinking about this anymore. And so I think that can be a tactic of like of institutional structures, or of keeping the system the same, is to say it can be dismissed if it's one generation. But if it's intergenerational, you have a kind of building of coalition that then becomes hard to ignore.
That's powerful. That's really powerful. And having everyone involved, the parents, the grandparents, the youth, and the children. And the children.
Yeah.
Children are pretty honest with us, in their endeavors. I find that with my grandchildren. Yeah, thank you. So how are you finding in an institution, UCLA, within faculties that maybe give you, and I'm just assuming here, give you a little bit more leeway when you're in the arts and the culture? That might be true, that might not be true. How are you able to mentor and bring a message that is able to be heard within the university?
So the good thing about being in a university is that we do have intellectual freedom, and that is more or less guaranteed to us. So there has obviously been a lot of pushback towards universities in recent years, and particularly about the importance of politics in the humanities. But universities continue to be a space where we can debate ideas. And I think that's one of the things that's incredibly valuable about universities. Universities have a history of being involved in citizenship and understanding what citizenship is. And I don't mean that like in terms of like legal citizenship, but more what it is to be part of a community that's larger than oneself. Whether that's an immediate community, at the city level, national, international level. And so I think that's a wonderful opportunity that we have in the university setting. In terms of more tangible considerations, I currently teach, I'm fortunate enough to teach on a course that is called Food as a Lens for the Environment and Sustainability. It's a year-long course for first-year students. They're taught by 4 faculty, plus teaching fellows in their last quarter. And it's a wonderful collaboration that I get to be part of with 3 scientists and then myself as the humanities person. So I get to teach about problems within the food system, particularly all the scientific information. After all the scientific information gets presented to them, looking at the damage caused by animal agriculture, I get to delve into questions about, well, why is the system in place? And what are the social, political, economic, and cultural conditions that have enabled this? What are the obstacles to creating a more just food system? And what can we do to remove those obstacles? And it's a very large course. There's about 180 students enrolled. So it's a really, I think, amazing opportunity to start conversations about these issues, and also to reach out to younger people or people who are at an earlier phase of their academic and intellectual life, to reach out to them and say, like, what can we do about this? And how can we mobilize? And how can we build a more just food system?
In a whole year, that's great. You know, a whole year spending time with these people, these young people. How many do you think go vegan after this course?
It's hard to say, I've definitely had students from this course and from a course I taught before called Food Politics, Cultural Solutions to Political Problems, who've reached out individually and have said, I've gone vegan. I haven't tracked the numbers, but I think what I get more excited about is even more than individual students going vegan are the students who've decided to devote some of their academic life or their working life to finding problems, identifying problems in the food system and fixing them. And so I sort of see this also as a project of like trying to reach the right people, trying to reach the person who will become mobilized. And I've had wonderful outcomes where students, a student has just wrote to me recently and said he's been working with a community garden at a, I believe it's at a church in an underserved area. And they're working on building and developing their community garden. I've had a former student who formed an organization on campus focused on the food system and animal liberation, and particularly looking at career opportunities, developing career opportunities for students for whom this is important. And so that the number of students who actually mobilize might be relatively small, but every student who does mobilize reaches so many more people, so there is a sort of potential for an exponential spread of a sort of social justice commitment.
Yeah, that's great. That's really, really lovely. And that's what it's about, right? Opening those webs and providing food where food, so many food deserts in the world and places where people can't afford to get real food, and helping them, empowering them to grow it. I mean, there's so much little spots of land that we need very little land to grow a lot of food.
Yeah. And then also like mobilizing around, to change city ordinances so that it is possible for people to grow their own food. There have been really, difficult kinds of things that have happened in Los Angeles, where, for example, there was a plot of industrial land that was taken over for a community garden, and the city shut it down. There have been legal cases about people using the part of their front lawn for growing, or the side of like the patch of grass between the sidewalk and the street, and the city tried to crack down on it. So, working systemically as well, thinking about like, oh, okay, so why is it that, we have like these nice community gardens in some of the more affluent neighborhoods, but the effort to set up a community garden in an underserved community suddenly becomes more difficult. And what can we do to change that, importantly?
Right. And all the fruit trees that can be planted, we're planting trees. The city is planting trees. It could be planting fruit trees that are available to anyone that wants to come and pick them, come and grab an
Yeah.
apple. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that would be amazing. So you're working on a book right now. Would you like to share a little bit about your book and any other project that you're working on?
Sure. So I'm writing a book right now on physicality and emotion in social justice movements. The book, it's called Bodies on the Line. And what I'm looking at is how very particular social justice movements mobilize, activate, immobilize, and evoke emotion in the interest of social change. The book is structured around 4 key emotions, which is grief, compassion, care, and hope. And in the examples that I'm looking at, activist efforts are phased or sort of intentionally constructed around one primary emotion. And often it's conjoined with other activist efforts that connect to the other emotion. So none of them stands on its own, but together they form almost like a roadmap of how justice efforts can operate by acknowledging grief, which is, in the case of systemic violence, systemic harm is invisibilized and its victims are often considered to be irrelevant. So just the act of grieving publicly is political. In the case of compassion, it's often about reaching out to help individuals who are at risk of harm, immediate harm, so saving individual lives. Care is about the question of what comes next. If an individual life, if an individual has been, if their efforts at saving themselves has been facilitated successfully, then what? What kind of support can be created, or what kind of support has been can be generated? And so then care is sort of about networks of community support. And then hope is, how do we imagine a better future? How do we imagine a future where systemic harm doesn't happen? So the three examples of social justice efforts that I'm talking about are very different from one another, although they all in different ways do connect to the climate crisis. So one of them is mobility justice and urban cycling. And the systemic harm that's being looked at is road violence, the normalization of road violence. The second one is border solidarity efforts. And the systemic harm is obviously the militarization of borders. And then the third example that runs throughout is farmed animal rescue, with the systemic violence being animal exploitation.
Wow. And we're seeing a lot of bodies on the line right now. I mean, there's a lot of youth that don't feel hope, that don't feel care, and don't feel compassion by a lot of people in their lives. And so it's instilling a system where people, if they are able to find a way through, that they have the support and the care to continue to want to find meaning and direct that in a way that allows them to feel a part of a whole, really.
Right. And I think that's part of what social justice actions do, is that they build community. So in this project, I'm looking not so much at like symbolic protest, but other kinds of justice efforts, what I'm calling reflexive activism, which is where activists protest a form of systemic harm while living out its alternatives. So say in the case of animal exploitation, the grief action is animal save protests, or animal save vigils, actually, at slaughterhouses. Compassion would be animal rescue, like open rescue projects or planned rescue, where individual animals are taken from animal exploitation or from slaughterhouses. Care is farm sanctuaries. And then hope is places like Piedmont Animal Refuge or Vine Sanctuary, where actually the sanctuary space is reimagined along the lines of maybe what would be more comfortable for the animal rather than the conditions in which they were exploited. And so I think part of what happens in that process of like, it's about taking the effort to intervene on behalf of individuals. And it's also about doing something publicly that does make a statement. And it's about mapping out a vision for like, look, this is how it could be different. And at the same time, it's also about creating community. It's about bringing people together who are invested in a particular issue and who care about the systemic violence happening, and saying, the problem is the system. The problem is not you. Okay? The problem isn't that you feel this too intensely. The problem is that the system is causing harm.
That's really, really valuable. So not to turn anybody into a victim, to say, there's, you don't have to do anything about it, or the world is just crap and there's nothing we can do about it, but to say we don't have to take so much individual responsibility for feeling, overwhelmed, sad, grief struck, and to see it as a systemic issue, and also see that we're also part of that systemic solution, that our input, our healing matters.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's a way of taking that emotion and saying, like, this emotion is not an aberration. This emotional is is a normal response to systemic
Right.
harm. And the problem is that we're taught to ignore those emotions. And we're taught to look at certain forms of violence that happen to certain beings as inevitable. And by activating those emotions and actually making those emotions public, that's a way of saying, no, this form of systemic harm is not normal or natural or inevitable. It's actually something that we can change.
Right. I really appreciate that you're saying this reaction, these emotions that we've stuffed down because they weren't accepted. They're really not accepted. We learn that very young, most of us, that most of our emotions aren't accepted.
Mhm.
And normalizing that and saying, this is a systemic issue and we're going to deal with it that way. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap it up today?
No, I don't think so. We've covered a lot. And this is a wonderful prelude to the VCOP conference. I think it's going to be a really illuminating and engaging event.
Thank you so much for being here and for doing the work you do with our youth, because it makes such a difference for young people to know that there's other choices and that the way that they're responding to the world is normalized if it doesn't feel good, and that there's a lot of not feel good things that are happening, and that we are all here many of us are here trying to make a systemic difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you.